The storm had rolled in without warning, a dark blanket of clouds smothering the late evening sky. The wind picked up, whipping the trees into frantic, skeletal shapes that clawed at the darkening horizon. As the storyteller closed the blinds and latched the windows, an odd sense of unease settled over them, a tingling sensation that something was watching, waiting in the shadows. The rain began to fall in sheets, cascading down in a relentless rhythm, a constant battering against the roof and walls of the old house. Thunder rumbled in the distance, each peal a reminder of nature's raw power lurking just beyond the fragile safety of the home's walls. The storyteller, usually one to enjoy a storm, found themselves growing restless. The house felt strange tonight, as if something had shifted in its quiet, familiar interior. They couldn't place it. Perhaps it was the silence between the thunderclaps, the emptiness that seemed to stretch too far, as if it were trying to swallow the usual sounds of the house. Even the creaks and groans of the old wood, sounds they had grown used to, now seemed ominous, an echo of something unspoken and eerie. As they were heading to bed, an unexpected noise pierced the storm's droning roar, a soft but persistent scratching sound coming from the front door. It was so subtle at first that they dismissed it as a tree branch or a wayward object blown by the wind. But as the scratching grew louder and more insistent, curiosity gave way to a prickling dread. Who or what could be out there, in the storm, clawing at their door with such urgency? They moved slowly toward the entrance, each step echoing louder than usual in the tense silence. The scratching paused for a moment, and they held their breath, waiting, hoping it was just a figment of their imagination. But then it resumed, this time accompanied by a faint whine, barely audible through the heavy downpour. A chill ran down their spine. It sounded like an animal, something desperate. They took a deep breath, steeling themselves before unlocking the door and pulling it open a crack. Rain poured in immediately, splattering the floor in icy droplets. But there was something else. A shadow huddled against the porch's edge, partially obscured by the darkness and rain. They squinted, trying to make out the shape, and felt their heart skip a beat. It was a dog. It stood there, motionless, drenched to the bone, its fur hanging in wet clumps against its body. Its head was low, nearly touching the ground, and its eyes, those eyes were like nothing the storyteller had ever seen before. They were dark, almost impossibly black, like twin voids that seemed to absorb the dim light filtering from inside the house. But as they looked closer, they noticed something else, a glimmer, a faint sheen of emotion, a depth that spoke of sorrow, of loneliness so profound that it was almost palpable. The dog did not move. It simply stood there, staring up at the storyteller with those haunting eyes, as though it had been waiting for this moment, as if it knew that this was the only place it could find solace. The storyteller felt an odd compulsion, an urge to reach out, to comfort this strange, forlorn creature. They couldn't understand it. They had never been one to let strays inside. Yet something about this dog, about its presence, made it impossible to refuse. They opened the door wider, allowing the dog to step inside. The rain-soaked creature moving slowly, almost deliberately, as if conscious of each step it took, padded in, leaving a trail of wet paw prints across the floor, and stopped just a few feet from the storyteller. It shook itself once, sending a light spray of water in every direction, and sat down, its gaze never breaking from the storyteller's face. Standing before it, the storyteller felt a strange unease prickling at their skin, as if they were being studied, judged even, by this quiet, somber animal. The house, already dim, seemed to darken further with the dog's presence, its shadow stretching long and eerie under the faint glow of the entryway light. They tried to shake off the unsettling feeling, telling themselves it was just a dog, a lost creature seeking refuge from the storm. But as they continued to look into its eyes, that sense of wrongness grew, like a slow, creeping fog settling over their mind. After a few moments, they moved to fetch an old towel, wrapping it around the dog's shivering body. His fur was cold to the touch, almost unnaturally so, and they quickly pulled their hand back. Disturbed by the chill, the dog remained silent, its head turned slightly to watch their every movement. It was so still, so composed, that it didn't feel like an animal at all. It felt more like a person, a visitor from a place beyond. Observing with quiet intensity, they led it to the fireplace, which had died down to embers, and quickly rekindled the flames. Hoping the warmth would ease the dog's chill, it lay down near the fire, its eyes never leaving them, and curled up with a sigh, a sound that almost seemed human in its resignation, as if it had finally found a place to rest after a long, arduous journey. The storyteller sat in a nearby armchair, watching the dog as it drifted into what looked like a fitful sleep. Every now and then, its body would twitch, its legs moving as though it were running, and soft whines escaped its throat, like the remnants of a painful memory clawing its way to the surface. The storyteller felt a pang of sympathy, mixed with an irrational fear that grew with each twitch, each whimper. It was as if the dog were haunted, pursued by something that even sleep couldn't erase. They watched it for what felt like hours, unable to look away, drawn by a fascination they couldn't explain. The storm outside raged on, lightning flashing across the windows, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. But inside, the house was quiet, save for the occasional crackling of the fire and the soft, troubled sounds of the dog's breathing. As the night wore on, the storyteller's exhaustion began to pull at them, yet they couldn't bring themselves to leave the dog alone. There was a tension in the air, a feeling that if they left the room, something would change, something irreversible and dark. They kept their vigil, their gaze fixed on the dog, noting every flicker of its eyes, every twitch of its ears, every subtle shift in its posture. Just before dawn, the storm began to subside, the rain easing into a gentle patter, and the wind dying down to a low murmur. The fire had long since burned out, leaving only a faint warmth in the room. The storyteller, now barely awake, blinked slowly, fighting the pull of sleep, and then, just as their eyelids drooped, the dog opened its eyes. It looked at them, its gaze sharper, more intense than before. The sadness was still there, but there was something else now, something that made the storyteller's blood run cold. It was an awareness, a look that seemed almost knowing. For a fleeting moment, they felt as though the dog could see through them, into their thoughts, their memories, their deepest fears. It was an unsettling sensation, one that left them feeling vulnerable, exposed. The dog held their gaze for what felt like an eternity, and then, as dawn's first light crept through the window, it rose, padding silently to the front door. The storyteller, still dazed from the strange encounter, followed it, opening the door to let it out. But the dog didn't leave. It stood on the threshold, looking back at them one last time, its dark eyes filled with that same haunting sorrow, that same quiet plea for understanding. And then, without a sound, it turned and disappeared into the fading mist, its shadow merging with the morning fog until it was gone. The storyteller closed the door, a hollow feeling settling in their chest. The house felt different now, emptier, as though a presence had been lifted, leaving behind only the lingering traces of something unspeakable. They returned to the armchair by the cold hearth, wrapping themselves in a blanket and staring into the shadows that still clung to the corners of the room. In the days that followed, they found themselves haunted by the memory of the dog, by those dark, sorrowful eyes that had seen something beyond their understanding. They found wet paw prints near the door, long after the floors had dried, and at night, they could almost swear they heard the soft scratching sound once more, as though the dog had returned, still searching for something it had lost. And so the storyteller waited, their heart heavy with a dread they could not name, wondering if they would ever see the strange creature again, or if it had simply been a messenger from a world beyond, a ghostly visitor carrying with it a sadness that would forever haunt the quiet corners of their mind. The days that followed the dog's arrival were filled with a creeping, inexplicable tension, though the rainstorm had passed, leaving the world outside bright and fresh. Inside the house, a sense of gloom seemed to settle in. The dog had settled into a routine. Though it was anything but ordinary, it moved through the house in silence, its presence more a shadow than a pet, slipping from room to room with a quiet purpose that the storyteller found both curious and unsettling. From the beginning, the dog had displayed peculiar behaviors, habits that went beyond anything the storyteller had seen in an animal. It was almost as if it had its own unseen patterns, specific places it would go, certain things it would do, none of which seemed normal. During the day, the dog would follow the storyteller quietly, padding alongside them like a ghost, the steps light and deliberate. But at night, it seemed to come alive in a different way, as though guided by an invisible force only it could perceive. The first time the storyteller noticed the dog's strange nighttime behavior, they had been lying in bed, their eyes just starting to drift closed when a soft noise pulled them back to alertness. It was a faint, repetitive sound, something between a scratch and a scrape. Coming from the hallway, they lay still, listening, the hair on the back of their neck prickling with a strange foreboding. The sound stopped, replaced by a silence so thick it seemed to fill the room, pressing down on them. Moments later, they heard it again, soft, tentative scratching, like something brushing against the walls, making its way down the hallway toward the bedroom door. The storyteller held their breath, an irrational fear gripping them as the noise grew louder, coming closer with each passing second. They had an impulse to turn on the light, to break the darkness, but a strange paralysis held them in place, as though moving would somehow acknowledge the presence lurking in the hall. Finally, the sound stopped just outside the bedroom door, and for a brief, terrifying moment, there was silence. They could feel something there, just beyond the door, something that felt heavy and watchful. And then, slowly, almost reluctantly, the door creaked open a crack. The storyteller's breath hitched as they saw it, the dog's face, just barely visible in the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through the window. Its eyes gleamed faintly, fixed on them with a strange intensity that sent a chill down their spine. It stood there, unmoving, its gaze locked onto them with an expression that was hard to describe. There was a sadness there, yes, but something else as well, an unsettling awareness, as though it were studying them, trying to convey something it couldn't put into words. They waited, heart pounding, expecting the dog to move, to come into the room, but it didn't. It simply stood there, staring, its dark eyes reflecting a depth of emotion that felt almost human. And then, without a sound, it turned and padded silently back down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. After that night, the storyteller couldn't shake the feeling that they were living with more than just a dog. There was something wrong, something unspoken and deeply unsettling about the animal's presence. It seemed to carry a heaviness, a sorrow that permeated the house, lingering in the air like a scent. The storyteller began to notice other strange behaviors, patterns that grew more disturbing the longer they observed them. For one, the dog would only drink from certain bowls, but not just any bowls, only those placed in very specific spots around the house. The storyteller first noticed this one evening when they set a bowl of water in the kitchen, a place any ordinary dog would find perfectly acceptable. But the dog ignored it completely, moving instead to a forgotten corner of the living room, where it sat patiently, waiting, confused. The storyteller fetched the bowl and placed it near the dog, who then lapped up the water with slow, deliberate movements, its eyes fixed on some unseen point in the distance. Over the following days, the storyteller experimented, moving the bowl to different areas around the house. Each time, the dog ignored it, waiting until it was placed in one of a few specific locations: the dark corner near the basement door, the narrow space beneath the attic window, or the dusty alcove by the old, rarely used coat closet. Each of these places seemed to hold some significance to the dog, a ritual that only it understood. It was as though these spots were charged with a strange energy, an invisible thread connecting the animal to something beyond the ordinary, something the storyteller couldn't see but could feel, heavy and cold, lingering in the air. Then came the nights when the dog would leave the bedroom altogether, disappearing into the shadows of the house. The storyteller would lie awake, listening to its faint movements, the soft pads of its paws as it roamed the halls. It seemed to follow a pattern, moving through each room in turn, stopping in those specific spots as though performing some kind of ritual. They tried to follow it one night, curious and uneasy, but as soon as they stepped into the hallway, the dog stopped, turning to look at them with an expression that sent a chill through their bones. It was a warning, silent but unmistakable, and they retreated back to their room, heart racing, afraid of what they might discover if they pressed further. In the mornings, they would find small, inexplicable signs that the dog had been moving through the house, wet paw prints trailing through the living room, the faint scent of damp fur lingering in the air, as though it had just returned from some distant place. But the most disturbing evidence of its nocturnal activities came one night, when the storyteller awoke to find the dog sitting by the window, staring out into the darkness with an intensity that bordered on obsession. The storyteller watched it, transfixed, as it stood perfectly still, its gaze fixed on some unseen point beyond the glass. They moved closer, hoping to see what had captured the dog's attention. But there was nothing there, only the empty night, the faint glow of the moon, and the deep, impenetrable shadows. And yet, the dog seemed to see something that held it spellbound, his body tense and alert, as though waiting for a signal, a sign. It wasn't until the storyteller reached out, their hand hovering just above the dog's fur, that it moved, breaking its trance-like state and looking up at them with a gaze that was both haunted and grateful. It was as if, in that moment, it had returned from somewhere far away, some place that the storyteller could never reach. The dog settled back down, curling up at their feet, but the storyteller could not shake the feeling that it had brought something back with it. Something that now lingered in the house, unseen but felt in every shadow, every silence. In the following weeks, the dog's behavior grew more unpredictable. It would disappear for hours on end, slipping away into rooms it had previously ignored, only to reappear with an expression of weariness, as though it were carrying the weight of a journey only it could understand. And then there were the nights when it would whimper softly in its sleep, its body twitching and shivering, as though caught in the grip of a nightmare. The storyteller would reach out, trying to comfort it, but their touch seemed to make no difference. The dog would continue to whine, its eyes fluttering beneath closed lids, as if trapped in a world beyond their reach. But the strangest moment came one night, just before dawn, when the storyteller awoke to find the dog sitting by the foot of their bed, its gaze fixed on them with an intensity that was almost frightening. It was silent, unmoving, its eyes dark and filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to stretch into eternity. They stared back, unable to look away, caught in the depth of those eyes, feeling as though they were glimpsing something beyond the veil of the ordinary, something ancient and unknowable. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, the storyteller asked, "What are you?" The dog did not respond, of course, but it tilted its head, a small, almost imperceptible movement, as if it understood the question, as if it wanted to answer but could not. The storyteller felt a chill run down their spine, a sense of dread that had no reason, no explanation. They lay back down, pulling the covers up to their chin, trying to escape the gaze of those eyes, but sleep would not come. In the dim light of morning, they awoke to find the dog gone. Panicking, they searched the house, calling its name, checking every corner, every shadowed room, but there was no sign of it. Just when they began to fear it had disappeared for good, they found it in the basement, sitting in the farthest corner, its gaze fixed on the wall as though it could see through it, as though it were looking into some other realm. From that moment on, the storyteller felt an unshakable sense of unease. The dog's presence, once a comfort, had become something else, something that felt foreign, almost malevolent. It was as though a barrier had been crossed, a line they hadn't even known was there. They began to wonder if they had invited something into their home, something that had no place in the world of the living, something that carried with it the weight of another existence, one that they could never understand. And as the days turned to weeks, the dog's behavior continued to change, its movements becoming more erratic, its gaze darker, more distant. The storyteller found themselves sleeping less, haunted by the memory of those dark eyes, by the soft scratching sound that seemed to echo through the house at all hours. It was as though the dog were searching for something it could not find, and in its frustration, it had begun to unravel, to drift further and further from the creature they had first taken in. One evening, as they sat in the dim light of the living room, the storyteller caught a glimpse of the dog in the hallway, standing still, its head cocked to one side as though listening to something just beyond the range of human hearing. They watched it, heart pounding, feeling a surge of fear that made no sense, a fear that had no name but felt as real as the ground beneath their feet. And then, slowly, the dog turned its head, its gaze meeting theirs, its eyes filled with a sorrow so profound it felt like a weight pressing down on their chest, a sorrow that went beyond anything they could comprehend. In that moment, they understood that they were no longer living with a pet, no longer sharing their home with a simple animal. They were living with a presence, a shadow, a ghost of something that had once been alive but now existed only in the spaces between worlds. And as the dog turned and padded silently away, disappearing into the shadows of the house, the storyteller knew that they would never see it the same way again, that they would never escape the feeling that they had welcomed something into their life that they could never truly understand, something that would haunt the quiet corners of their mind long after it was gone. The weeks after the dog's arrival had brought with them an unshakable sense of dread. Strange incidents in the house seemed to follow one after another, each one more unsettling than the last. The dog's eerie, ritualistic behaviors, the scratching sounds that seemed to echo from nowhere, and those dark, sorrowful eyes all weighed on the storyteller's mind. Nights became sleepless, filled with half-remembered dreams of shadows and whispers, and days passed in a haze of unease. Then, one afternoon, a friend came by for a visit. It was an unexpected, almost jarring moment of normalcy. The storyteller hadn't realized just how much they had withdrawn into the shadows of their own home, how isolated they'd become since the dog had appeared. They greeted their friend with forced enthusiasm, but underneath the smiles and small talk, an anxiety prickled in the back of their mind. How could they explain the tension in the air, the feeling that their once familiar home had become a place of secrets and shadows? As they settled in the living room, their friends' laughter and easy conversation were a temporary balm, a welcome distraction. The dog lay in its usual spot by the fireplace, its dark, watchful eyes following them with a gaze that seemed almost expectant, as if it had been waiting for this encounter. The storyteller tried to ignore it, focusing instead on their friends' stories, the sound of their laughter, the warmth of company they had nearly forgotten. But then, their friend's gaze drifted to the dog, lingering there a moment longer than seemed natural. A strange expression crossed their face, a flicker of recognition, followed by a look of confusion, and finally, a growing unease. Where did you get that dog?" their friend asked, their voice hesitant, almost fearful. The storyteller hesitated, glancing over at the dog, which had not moved, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the two of them. A chill ran down their spine as they tried to answer, unsure of what to say. How could they explain the strange way the dog had appeared, the eerie feeling that it had brought something otherworldly with it? "It just showed up one night, during a storm," they said finally, keeping their voice low. "I don't know where it came from." Their friend nodded slowly, but their gaze remained locked on the dog, their face pale and tense. There was a strange look in their eyes, a look that was not simply fear, but something deeper, an unsettling familiarity. "You know, that dog," It looks exactly like one I knew a few years back." Their friend murmured, barely audible. "But it couldn't be. That dog died a long time ago." The storyteller felt their heart skip a beat. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows lengthening around them, as though the very air had thickened with something dark and oppressive. They stared at their friend, words failing them, as a creeping sense of horror began to settle in. The friend was silent, their gaze unfocused, as though lost in some distant memory. Finally, they spoke, their voice barely above a whisper. "There was a dog I had once, a long time ago. It looked just like this one, same dark eyes, same quiet presence. It even had those strange habits, just like this one does." The storyteller's hands clenched into fists, their nails digging into their palms. What do you mean?" Their friend hesitated, glancing around the room as though afraid of being overheard. "I don't know if you'd believe me," they began, their voice trembling. "But that dog, I found it under strange circumstances too. I was out hiking in the mountains, and there it was, just waiting, sitting alone, staring out into the distance as though it had been there for years." The storyteller felt a shiver run down their spine. The familiarity of their friend's story was almost too much to bear. It was as if they were reliving their own experience, yet through another's eyes, a twisted mirror that reflected their own fears and suspicions. Their friend continued, their gaze fixed on the dog, which lay still and silent by the fireplace, its eyes dark and unblinking. "It followed me home. I thought it was just a stray, something lost or abandoned, but it had this way about it, this presence that made it feel like more than just an animal. At night, it would wander the house, stopping in strange places, as if it were listening for something or someone, and it always had this way of looking at me, like it was trying to tell me something." The friend's voice faltered, and they glanced at the storyteller, their face pale. "It sounds ridiculous, I know, but after a while, I started to feel like it wasn't really a dog at all, like it was something else, something wearing the shape of a dog." The storyteller's breath hitched, and they found themselves glancing at the dog, which lay utterly still, its eyes fixed on the two of them with that same penetrating gaze. It felt as if the dog understood every word, as if it were silently bearing witness to the story being told. Then, one night, the friend continued, their voice barely more than a whisper. "The dog disappeared. It was like it had never been there. No trace, no paw prints, nothing. But I felt something in the house after it left. A coldness, a presence that lingered long after it was gone. I started having nightmares. Visions of the dog standing in the shadows, watching, waiting, and then I heard it, scratching at my door, just like it had before." They paused, taking a shaky breath, their eyes haunted. "I thought I'd imagined it, but every year, on the anniversary of the night it disappeared, I would hear it again, always at midnight, always scratching, always waiting, and now..." They looked at the dog, their eyes wide with terror. "Now, here it is, the same dog, or something wearing its shape, and I don't know if it's here for you, or if it's here because of me." The storyteller felt as though they were in a nightmare, trapped in a dark, endless void where reality had become twisted and unfamiliar. They wanted to deny it, to tell their friend they were mistaken, but the look in their friend's eyes, the tremor in their voice, left no room for doubt. They sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the revelation pressing down on them like a suffocating shroud. The dog continued to watch them, its eyes dark and unfathomable, filled with a depth of sorrow and knowledge that seemed to go beyond anything a simple animal could comprehend. Finally, the friend stood, their face pale and drawn. I think I should go. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have brought this up." But as they moved toward the door, the dog rose, padding silently after them, its movements slow and deliberate, as though it had been waiting for this moment. The friend froze, their gaze fixed on the dog, a look of terror flashing across their face. Please "Keep it away from me," they whispered, their voice trembling. The storyteller stepped between them and the dog, feeling an instinctive urge to protect their friend. Though they knew, deep down, that there was little they could do, they watched as their friend left, glancing over their shoulder one last time, their face a mask of fear and regret. When the door closed, the storyteller was left alone with the dog, its dark eyes fixed on them with a gaze that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone, straight into their soul. The house was silent, the air thick with an oppressive weight, as though something dark and unseen had taken up residence in the shadows. Watching, waiting. That night, the scratching began again. It was louder this time, more insistent, as though something were desperate to be let in. The storyteller lay awake, their heart pounding, the memory of their friend's words echoing in their mind. And as they listened to the scratching, they knew, with a terrible certainty, that the dog was not just a visitor. It was something else, something that had been drawn to them, or perhaps to their friend, by a force beyond their understanding. They would never know for sure. All they knew was that, from that night forward, they would never be alone again. Not truly, for in the quiet darkness, in the shadowed corners of their home, the dog would always be there, watching, waiting, carrying with it a sorrow that could never be quenched, a sorrow that would haunt the storyteller for the rest of their days. It had been weeks since the storyteller's friend had left, but the chill of their parting words lingered, hanging in the air like a dark cloud. The house, once warm and familiar, had become a place of secrets and shadows. Every corner seemed darker than before. Every creak of the floorboards held an unspoken tension, as though the house itself had become an unwilling participant in whatever mystery had taken root within its walls. And at the center of it all was the dog, silent and watchful, moving through the rooms with an eerie grace, as if it were familiar with each crack, each shadow, each silent memory embedded in the old walls. The scratching continued almost every night now, echoing through the hallways, disturbing the stillness of the midnight hours. Each time, the storyteller would wake to the sound, heart pounding, skin cold with a fear they could neither explain nor shake. The noise came from different places: the front door, the basement stairs, sometimes even from just outside the bedroom window. It was as if something were trying to get in, to make itself known, to break through whatever barrier separated it from the living. One night, the storyteller awoke again to the sound of scratching. This time, however, it was different, louder, more insistent, as if whatever was making the noise was desperate. They sat up in bed, the darkness around them feeling thick and suffocating. Pressing in from all sides, the dog was lying at the foot of the bed, but unlike its usual calm, silent self, it was tense, its ears pricked, its gaze fixed on the bedroom door. There was something in its eyes that the storyteller hadn't seen before, an intensity, an alertness that seemed almost protective. The scratching grew louder, escalating into a frenzied, frantic sound that echoed through the room, filling the air with an unbearable tension. The storyteller's breath came in shallow gasps, their heart pounding as they tried to summon the courage to move. They glanced at the dog, which remained still, his gaze unwavering, his body poised as though ready to spring into action. Finally, unable to bear the noise any longer, the storyteller rose from the bed, their footsteps silent as they crossed the room. The scratching stopped abruptly as they reached the door, plunging the house into a silence so profound it felt unnatural, as though even the walls were holding their breath. They opened the door, peering into the dimly lit hallway, expecting to find nothing but shadows. But there, at the far end of the hallway, they saw it, the dog. Yet it was not by their side, where they knew it had been only moments before. It was at the end of the hall, standing perfectly still, its eyes fixed on something just beyond the storyteller's line of sight. The storyteller's heart pounded as they looked back at the bed, only to find it empty. The dog that had been by their side was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. A wave of nausea washed over them as they turned back to the hallway, their gaze meeting the dog's intense, unwavering stare. It stood in the shadows, almost blending into the darkness, its form indistinct, as if it were not entirely solid. Slowly, they took a step forward, compelled by a force they couldn't understand. The dog did not move. It only watched, its gaze dark and sorrowful, as though it were pleading with them, warning them. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly, the walls narrowing, closing in as they walked. Their footsteps were soundless, swallowed by the silence, each step feeling heavier than the last. When they finally reached the end of the hallway, they stopped, feeling a chill settle over them, seeping into their bones. The dog was no longer there, but the door to the basement stood open, revealing a set of stairs descending into darkness. The air was thick with a damp, musty scent, the smell of earth and decay, as though the basement had been untouched for centuries. They hesitated, staring down into the darkness, a sense of dread coiling in their stomach. But something compelled them to move, an unseen force that drew them forward, down the stairs, step by step, deeper into the shadows. The darkness seemed to thicken as they descended, enveloping them, muffling every sound, every breath, until they felt as though they were submerged in an endless void. At the bottom of the stairs, they paused, their hand trembling as they reached for the light switch. They flicked it on, but nothing happened. The bulb above them remained dark, shrouding the basement in an impenetrable gloom. A faint rustling sound echoed from somewhere in the darkness, a soft, whispering noise that sent a chill down their spine. It was a sound like dry leaves skittering across stone, a sound that seemed to come from all around them, filling the silence with a sense of creeping dread. They squinted, their eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness, and they saw it, the dog, standing in the far corner of the basement, his gaze fixed on the wall. His body was rigid, tense, as though it were waiting for something that lurked just beyond the veil of shadows. The storyteller felt a surge of fear, an instinctual urge to flee, but their feet remained rooted to the spot, held in place by an invisible force. The dog's gaze shifted, turning to meet theirs, and in that moment, the storyteller saw something they could not explain. The dog's eyes were dark, yes, but within them, they could see a faint glimmer, a reflection of something hidden deep within. It was as though the dog's eyes were windows, and through them, they glimpsed a place beyond, a world of shadows and secrets, a realm that was neither of the living nor the dead. And then, without warning, the scratching began again, louder this time, echoing through the basement, filling the space with a cacophony of sound. It was relentless, an assault on their senses, a noise that seemed to burrow into their mind, clawing at their thoughts, their memories, their very sense of self. They covered their ears, but the sound persisted, growing louder, more insistent, until it was all they could hear, all they could feel. The dog moved, stepping closer, its eyes never leaving theirs, its expression filled with a sorrow so profound it seemed to seep into their soul. The scratching grew louder still, a maddening, ceaseless noise that drove them to the edge of sanity, until finally, they screamed, a raw, desperate sound that echoed through the darkness, swallowed by the shadows. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the scratching stopped. The silence was absolute, crushing, a silence that felt as though it could devour them whole. The storyteller stood there, trembling, their mind reeling, their senses dulled by the overwhelming terror that had consumed them. The dog was gone. They looked around, their gaze darting from shadow to shadow, but there was no sign of it, no trace that it had ever been there. The basement was empty, silent, the darkness oppressive and suffocating. They stumbled back, their heart pounding, a sense of dread settling over them as they realized they were alone. Or so they thought. As they turned to ascend the stairs, a cold, spectral hand brushed against their shoulder, sending a jolt of terror through their body. They froze, their skin prickling, their breath catching in their throat as they felt the faintest pressure. The weight of something unseen, pressing against them. It was a touch that carried with it a sense of sorrow, a despair so deep it felt as though it could consume them whole. They turned, slowly, their eyes wide with fear, but there was nothing there, only shadows, stretching long and dark across the walls, their edges blurred, shifting, as though they were alive. In the days that followed, the storyteller was haunted by the memory of that touch, by the sense of presence that lingered in the house, filling every room with an oppressive silence. The dog never returned, but they could feel it, always, just at the edge of their vision, a shadow that seemed to watch them from the corners of the room, a presence that filled the air with a cold, unyielding sorrow. They found themselves glancing over their shoulder, half expecting to see it there, standing in the shadows, watching, waiting. And on stormy nights, when the wind howled through the trees and the rain battered against the windows, they would hear it, the faint scratching, echoing through the house, a reminder of the presence that had once shared their home. The house became a prison, a place of shadows and silence, a space where the living and the dead seemed to coexist, each one aware of the other, yet unable to bridge the divide. The storyteller withdrew from the world, their days blending into one another, filled with a quiet, lingering despair that had no explanation, no end. And as the years passed, the house fell silent, its rooms empty, its walls crumbling. But on stormy nights, when the world was shrouded in darkness and the wind howled through the empty hallways, the scratching would return, a ghostly echo of the past, a reminder of the presence that had once haunted its walls. To this day, those who pass by the old, abandoned house speak of a shadow that lingers in the windows, a dark, sorrowful figure that watches the world with eyes that seem to carry the weight of centuries. And those brave enough to venture inside tell stories of scratching sounds that echo through the halls, of a cold, spectral hand that brushes against them in the darkness, a reminder of the secrets the house holds, secrets that will never be spoken, secrets that will linger forever in the shadows. The dog is gone, but its presence remains, a ghostly echo that haunts the empty rooms, a sorrowful spirit bound to a place that can never be a home, a reminder of the mysteries that lie just beyond the veil, waiting, watching, forever.